Okay, I think it's time to get started. So I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar on Take Virtual Collaboration to the Next Level. We're kicking off 2021 with a bang. We have some new research to share, some insights into the current state of virtual collaboration, and hopefully some practical advice and ideas to make it better for everyone involved. So before we get started, I just have a few process notes and things I want to share. Um, so we've got a pretty big audience today, and I want to make sure. Oh, I knew I was going to go too far. There we go. So we're going to have everybody on mute in order to avoid background noise, but we really do want your questions, your comments. This is a topic that is top of mind for a lot of people, and a lot of people have some really interesting experiences and opinions, and we want to make sure that we capture that. So you have a couple of different ways that you can submit questions and comments. You can do that by typing them in the Q&A panel to the right of your screen, or when we get to the end of the broadcast, we're also hopefully going to be able to take a question or two or comment live. And you can let us know that you'd like to talk to us by hitting the little raise your hand button that looks like a hand in your panel. And then hopefully we'll be able to call on you and unmute your lines. So we're going to address as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation, and you will get a copy of the slides and recording sometime in the next few days. So for those of you that that don't know me, I'm Lauren Trees, and I lead the Knowledge Management Research Program here at APQC. And I have one of my colleagues with me here today. Alyssa, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure, my pleasure. My name is Alyssa Tucker. I head up the Human Capital Management Research area at APQC, so focus on topics such as recruiting, training and development, performance management, and I'm really excited to be here with Lauren today to talk about the topic of virtual collaboration.
And the research that I want to talk about today does have a little bit of a knowledge management flavor, but virtual collaboration is one of those topics that touches on IT and information services, on knowledge management, on learning and HR. So I'm really excited to have Alyssa on the call. We've talked through the findings as I've been digging through the data, and she's really helped me see some of the implications for HR and for individual managers. So I want to start by telling you something that you already know, which is that 2020 brought huge, drastic changes to the world of virtual collaboration. And the data that you see on this slide and all of the research that we'll talk about today are from our virtual collaboration Rules of the Road survey, which closed with more than 800 participants in October. And this chart compares in-person and virtual collaboration before and after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So before COVID, 57% of our respondents interacted with coworkers primarily in person, and only 8% were virtual almost entirely. And then after COVID, 84% said their coworker reactions were primarily virtual. And whenever we see that kind of rapid, aggressive shift, you can expect some things to evolve quickly and work amazingly well, and some things probably going to be a hot mess, right? So this is not, I think, a flash in the pan that some people thought maybe it was in March or April. At least some of this interaction is going to stay virtual. In the 10 months that people have been working virtually, 20 million employees have moved away from where their office is, and companies have let that happen. And a lot of companies are giving up leases on office space. We definitely see this boulder moving downhill. So I think we all have to come to terms with some new ways of working and get out of crisis mode and start really taking this to the next level. So we thought it would be fun to start with a quick poll. And I don't want all of you to overthink this, but I want to know which word best describes your experience with virtual collaboration over the last year. Is it normal, status quo, fun, engaging, demanding, exhausting? And if none of this fits, you can put your own word into the chat. And Alyssa, I know you have kind of a unique perspective on this. So
I
I was hoping you could describe your experience over the
it,
last year.
Yes, I definitely will. And it may surprise some people, but my answer to this poll would be engaging. And that's because I have been working full time from home for many years. And so when my APQC colleagues went, all virtual in March, the usage of our internal collaboration tools, such as the capabilities of Microsoft Teams, just went way up. And so I've been for the last 10 months collaborating more than before. And that has been really engaging. But Lauren, I will also share that the number of meetings that I am in, the number, of interruptions, via, like chat messages and things has really gone up. So I can relate to D&E, demanding and exhausting as well.
Yeah, I think I relate to a lot of these. And I think we're seeing that in the poll results. So about a quarter of people, this is just normal status quo. A lot of people found it demanding, and then equal parts engaging and exhausting. And I think I would agree with that too. It is equal parts engaging and exhausting. Um, Very few people said it was fun. I don't know what that tells us, but hopefully we can make it a little bit more fun and a little bit more engaging and less exhausting for people as we go forward. See if I can get things moving here. So I think it's really interesting to see. I don't know if I have control here. I'm not getting any love from the slides. But I think it's really interesting to see there we go, all the perspectives. And, if you go through the comments on the survey, you definitely see the good, the bad, and the ugly of virtual collaboration. But I want to start with the good news. Overall, 3/4 of the 800 respondents to our survey said they were either satisfied or very satisfied with the current state of virtual collaboration in their organization. And people are definitely seeing some tangible benefits. And a lot of them are perceived efficiency gains. Almost everyone loves not commuting. That's no big surprise. But a lot of people feel like they get things done faster, discussions are more to the point with less small talk. And nearly a third of people said that the ease of sharing and reusing knowledge, was one of the top benefits of virtual collaboration. So I think that indicates a real opportunity for embedding better, more seamless knowledge flow as work goes more digital. But when you scratch the surface on the data, what we find is that virtual collaboration works better for some things than others. It's really great for team-based collaboration, for status updates, even for co-creating deliverables if you have some good platforms for, multiple people working on a document. And it's possible for broader communication, for troubleshooting, for some strategic work. When you really start to see problems crop up is when you get to creative collaboration, like brainstorming and innovation, as well as collaboration that requires a lot of social capital and a lot of trust. So things like consensus building, team building and camaraderie, change management. And then virtual, at least in its current incarnation, because I do think that we can make this better, is absolutely terrible at replicating the kind of unstructured, serendipitous exchanges that people are used to having in the hallways, at the coffee bar, at the water cooler. Only about 1 in 4 people said that their organizations were even passively effective at that kind of collaboration virtually. And interestingly, that number is even lower for younger workers, so millennials and Gen Z. And I think that kind of is a clear reflection also of the challenges that people cite working virtually. So the top two are very well aligned with the effectiveness data that we looked at on the last slide. You miss out on those water cooler conversations, and it's harder to do complex work like innovation and problem solving when you're virtual. And then the rest of the top 5 challenges focus on a different problem, namely chaos. When you have this sudden shift to virtual working, many organizations just don't have the right infrastructure and support in place. They don't have norms and policies to guide virtual collaboration. They have a ton of overlapping, disconnected, confusing platforms, and they don't have sufficient training to show people not just what buttons to push, but the context of how they want people to behave on the platforms. So we're going to talk about all of that as we move forward today. Because the way I see it, we're really at a pivotal moment when it comes to virtual collaboration. People have been pretty open minded about the changes. One person that I interviewed last year said, well, change resistance really falls away when you have no choice. And I think that that has been the experience at scale over the last year. And people have given employers a lot of grace, recognizing that no one was prepared for what happened and it was going to take some time to get into the groove of things. And most organizations have given employees some grace as well in navigating a tough year. But if this is a longer term shift, we can't keep treating this like a stopgap that we threw together in a crisis. Virtual collaboration is here to stay in some capacity at least. And we need to extend its capabilities so it supports a broader cross section of complex work objectives. And we need to support collaborators with clear guidelines, guardrails, and expectations. If more people are going to work from anywhere and these digital platforms are their workplace, then it becomes critical, not just for productivity, but also for recruitment, engagement, and retention, that whole employee experience and employee life cycle. So for the rest of the call, we're going to dig into 5 ways to fix or improve virtual collaboration. So we can look at this as our agenda for the remainder of the call. First, I want to talk about virtual meeting culture and how we can make meetings limited and purposeful. Then next, I want to talk about getting people outside the bubbles of their individual departments and teams and get them to capitalize on some of the platforms and behaviors that they've built to collaborate better across boundaries outside of their traditional silos. Then third, I want to talk about the need to streamline options and to clarify what kind of collaborative activity happens where. Then I want to talk about this issue of norms and guidelines, addressing that chaos that we're looking at in the top 5 challenges. And then finally, I want to talk about empowering people to set boundaries for their collaborative time. And Alyssa, I know when you and I were talking, we were thinking about the role that KM and HR play in all of these. So I wanted to ask you about that here.
Yeah, definitely. So when I look at this slide, I think about, if you are trying to tackle these from an organizational perspective, it really to me seems very important that a number of players play a big role and ideally are coordinated in how they approach these things. So I'm thinking of KM, HR, but also business leaders and managers. I don't want to I really want to emphasize the role that I think managers can play in making these things work. And just really I think you and I had talked about really a role for KM as well as HR in setting up that infrastructure that can make virtual collaboration, more successful in your organization.
I think one of the biggest mistakes that we're seeing is that companies are allowing IT to own the collaboration strategy. We're seeing that in about 3/4 of companies. And IT is obviously a key stakeholder. They have a huge role to play here. But some people who have the strategic people aspect of this in mind and understand policies and human behavior really need to be involved in setting up the right infrastructure and enablers to make this happen
Yes,
effectively.
definitely.
So, our first imperative for taking virtual collaboration to the next level is fixing some of this mess surrounding virtual meetings. And as I said, making them more limited and more purposeful. And when we look at the changes we see to how people work, the upsurge in virtual meetings is the most drastic change that we see over the last year. Most respondents list virtual meetings, both with and without video, as highly critical to their work. And a majority say that these meetings have become significantly more critical to work in the wake of the pandemic. And some of the reasons for this are obvious, but Alyssa, I know you had some thoughts on why we're in so many more virtual meetings than even we were in-person meetings a year ago, and why we see this trend so intensely.
Sure, Lauren. When I look at these results, I think about, yes, there is a need for more virtual meetings when everybody is remote, but I also think that some of these meetings, or a good portion of them, are happening for other purposes. Meetings can be a way for managers to visually see that their employees are still working. And so that can be kind of a crutch for managers as they make the transition to being, virtual managers. They can also be a way for employees to prove, to managers, to their peers that, hey, I'm here, I am working, I'm being productive. So I think, this to me says that we really need to make sure that we're equipping managers and project team leaders to learn to use and encourage the use of virtual meetings for the right reasons, for productive, true collaboration reasons, and then to be deliberate and really communicate with employees and managers, about, how are we going to evaluate employees in a virtual environment? And for employees, how can they stay visible and be remembered for, career progression type of opportunities in this case? So it won't be so tempting to use meetings as a crutch.
There's such an interesting performative aspect to that because as we are all showing that we're working, we're actually probably getting less done than we would be if we were not in all of these meetings.
Exactly, which is why this is so important, that we look at this deliberately.
And I think that that plays out in a lot of the data that we've collected around this. Part of the reason we're meeting so much is that no one's stopping us. Only 8% of people on our survey said that their organizations have any meeting limits in terms of the number or frequency of meetings that people are in. And the other reason is that we don't have a lot of checks on what constitutes a meeting. Only about a third of people said that their organizations have any set criteria for meetings, such as a requirement to share an agenda ahead of time or a set of objectives for the meeting. And that's something that people really want. 52% said that they think virtual collaboration would be more effective if their workplace had clearer meeting criteria. That was the number one thing that people wanted, their number one ask on the survey. And the way that I read a lot of this data is that people are in too many meetings, many without clear objectives. And as a result, they're not giving those meetings their full attention, probably in some cases because they don't merit their full attention. And that's also part of why people want better norms and guidelines for staying attentive in meetings, for turning video on and off, all of these different things that are part of how you perform in meetings and how you show that you're present and paying attention. And it's also interesting here that 1 in 4 people said that one of the top benefits of virtual collaboration is that it's easier for them to multitask. So if people are multitasking in their meetings and that's the top benefit of working virtually, then I feel like we have a root cause problem to deal with. And video creates its own set of challenges, but a lot of these problems are not actually unique to virtual meetings. They are problems with meetings. So I think the virtual environment has exacerbated some of them and brought them to the surface, but they were probably very much with us, a year ago or 2 years ago and so forth. So what are some simple things that we can do to improve virtual meeting culture? For some, I think meetings, and Alyssa was alluding to this, have become a default mode of communication. And I think we need to retrain people that if something can happen in a collaboration thread or even an email, then it should be that. And you meet only when you need that deeper, more immediate interaction. And one exception to that is probably that managers do need to meet with their employees, especially as everyone's adjusting to virtual work. But I get the sense that a lot of managers are getting everyone together in a big meeting when what they really need to be doing is having quick, more frequent check-ins with individuals and small teams, to really focus in on what those people are working on, what challenges or roadblocks they're having, and working those things out. We need a more balanced approach to video. I think that's really important. Video is engaging. It makes the meeting leader feel great because they can see everyone's paying attention. And it can be useful for social feedback. I've been in a lot of video meetings where if I couldn't see that person, I would not understand how they were taking in what I was saying, what their reaction was. But Zoom fatigue is a real problem. It is exhausting to perform for the camera, especially when you're just listening and not engaged in dialogue. And what the data is showing us is that that's particularly true for women. So this can be a diversity and inclusion issue as well. So if you're having a long meeting, I think you can manage this better. Maybe you have everyone turn their cameras on for the meet and greet at the beginning, and then you have people switch off if they're not presenting or part of an active discussion. And then next, you really have to put some burden on meeting organizers to set a purpose and a plan for each meeting. If they're asking for people's time, then they need to prepare. And that also gives people enough information about what the meeting's about to push back if they don't think the meeting's necessary or if they think that their attendance is not necessary in the meeting. And part of that culture is making it okay to push back, to ask, hey, is this something I really need to be part of? But that's part of a tit for tat bargain where if you do need to be part of the meeting and everyone agrees to that, then you're going to give that meeting your full attention and you're not going to be off writing your monthly report or playing free cell or, making your lunch. So I think that it's making them more limited, making them more purposeful, and then, the exchange for that has to be, better attention to that smaller number of meetings. So the next imperative I want to talk about is getting people out of their bubble to collaborate with colleagues who are outside their immediate work group. And aside from virtual meetings, where we've seen a massive upswing in the last year is around team-based collaboration. 59% people rate team or project sites as highly critical to their work, and the majority say that those team sites have become more critical since the onset of the pandemic. The numbers are a little bit lower for chat groups for teams and projects, but still almost half of participants say that those have become more critical to building and maintaining relationships with coworkers. And direct messaging that often happens in those same platforms also pretty critical and has become more critical since the onset of COVID. But we don't see that same upsurge in cross-boundary collaboration. When we look at key knowledge management tools like communities of practice, like enterprise social networks, like expertise location tools, like people profiles, less than a quarter of people rate any of these tools as highly critical to their work, and they've only gotten small bumps in the last year. So, when people are disconnected from that sneaker net in the office, I was really expecting them to be doing more in the virtual sphere to tap into the collective wisdom of the organization. And it's just not happening as much as I'd like. They're recreating their team and sort of immediate colleague interactions in the virtual world, but they haven't moved beyond that very limited environment in a lot of cases. And we see that play out so clearly in this particular data. We asked people, if you need expertise related to your work and you're not sure who to ask, who to tap into, what are your top 2 methods that you would use to find the right person? So this is a classic knowledge management use case. But what we find is that the vast majority are referring to either asking a colleague for recommendations or a manager for recommendations. And there's nothing wrong with that approach. You'll probably find somebody, but it's probably less efficient than a good community or people profile system. And the answer that you get is going to be limited to the professional network of the person that you ask. And obviously, this is somewhat complicated by the fact that some people may not have active communities to tap into or a good updated people profile system. But when they do, they're still gravitating to that informal network. And I really want to highlight this here because I think it's poised to get worse over time. Right now, virtual workers, have only been virtual for a matter of months, and they're capitalizing on the networks and the personal relationships that they have from working with their colleagues in the office. But as the workforce becomes more hybrid and people get further away from those day-to-day face-to-face relationships that they have, and people come into the organization who've never worked face-to-face with their colleagues, you end up with some loosening here. And so this may be working okay in year one, but it's something companies need to address, especially if they're going to have more virtual work and hybrid work going forward. And the good news is that KM does help with some of these virtual collaboration challenges that we laid out earlier. So I think we have a solution to some of those problems, those top challenges. We looked at the subset of people who said that virtual collaboration was effective in their workplace for some of those tough tasks. Things like the serendipitous water cooler exchanges, brainstorming and innovation, change management, and even team building and camaraderie. And when we looked at that subset, one of the striking characteristics is they were much more likely to rate KM tools as critical to work. They are heavy users of communities of practice, enterprise social networks, and expertise location. So I think that what this tells me is that KM works if you work it. And Alyssa, I know that when we were talking, you were also pointing out that employee listening has gotten a lot more challenging in this environment, and that things like communities and enterprise social networks can actually help with employee listening as well.
Exactly. I think employee listening becomes so important when employees are working remotely. As you think about what do employees need to support them in virtual collaboration, I think it is important to be able to ask them and listen to them. And certainly KM tools are enterprise social networks are a great place to have those conversations with your employees and find out what makes virtual collaboration effective for them. But also just to point out that these KM tools are a great place for you to observe what's happening with your employee, observe the conversations that are happening, and it's kind of a window into what's working and what isn't working in terms of your KM tools, and being able to tweak those so that they work better in your organization and better for your unique group of employees.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I most worry about with all of this team-based collaboration. It's happening inside walled gardens, and so there's a lot going on. And not that companies don't have access to that. We've talked about monitoring and things like that, but it's not necessarily very visible. And people are having those conversations behind closed doors. And if you can encourage people to move beyond that closed team environment into a more open, enterprise-wide collaborative environment, then you're going to surface the challenges, the benefits, the best practices so much faster, and be able to address any problems when they crop up versus if everybody is grumbling about something in their little team chat of 6 people, but that's not visible to managers or HR or anyone.
Exactly.
So you have to build that sense of trust, but you can
Yes.
move a lot faster if you have it.
Yes. Totally agree.
So how can we encourage collaboration across boundaries in these kinds of collaboration platforms? And I'll say APQC has a ton of resources around driving knowledge management, adoption, and engagement. And I could do a whole webinar on that, and I probably have done several. But what I wanted to focus on here is some ideas for harnessing this at this particular moment, to meet the moment of virtual work. People are more comfortable with virtual collaboration in a team-based setting now, so we need to use that to our advantage and encourage them to bring those same skills and behaviors to a community of practice or a Yammer network. We talk a lot about the business case for KM, and I do think it's important to reframe the business case and the what's in it for me in the context of virtual work. We've talked a couple of times about how people are struggling to not have those hallway conversations with doing innovation and brainstorming, and we need to present some of these KM tools and platforms as potential solutions to the problems people are having working virtually. There are some real pain points that you can speak to. It's important to offer training, and even if you've trained people before, to do it again. There may be some people who are more open to some of these tools and approaches now than they were a year or two ago. And then finally, it really helps to identify some advocates inside those teams, inside those closed conversations we were talking about, who can nudge people towards the more open channels. So if somebody asks in a project group a question and nobody knows the answer, maybe there's someone who's primed in that group to say, hey, it doesn't sound like anybody here knows. Why don't you go post that in the project management community of practice and see if somebody outside of our project team has a good answer. And just kind of using that peer feedback to drive people towards that behavior. And then as part of that, making it seamless and easy to jump between the team chat and your community practice so that people don't have to go over to another system and sign in, because we all know if it's not easy, then people are not going to do it. So the next topic I want to talk about really starts in on the combating chaos topic, streamlining options and clarifying what happens where. And what we find in the data is that people really want guidelines, and they're not getting them. They want to understand which apps to use, how to decide between different options and channels, whether they should send an email or put a Teams chat in, or what they should be doing, how to collaborate on documents, where to put questions and requests. And we're seeing a pretty cluttered landscape in this mad rush and very, good intentions to facilitate collaboration. I think a lot of IT departments have installed a lot of software or allowed people to install it, and different teams and platforms, are cropping up everywhere across organizations. And even when you do have, a standardized integrated platform, something like Microsoft 365, the vendors, in their infinite wisdom, give you multiple apps with overlapping capabilities. And they think that's great. It's flexible, you have options. But I think the reality is that it's driving people nuts. They're not sure where to go if they have a need. And then if somebody asks them a question, then 2 days later, they can't find it because they can't remember which of the 16 channels it came through. I know, this happens to me frequently. Was that an email? Was it in Teams? Was it in this other platform? Where did that request come through, and what's it attached to? And I think that there's a real sense of dislocation that people are feeling. And then the other piece that I wanted to touch on here is rules for creating, joining, and being added to virtual teams and groups. Who on this call has more teams or groups than they can possibly keep up with, and half of them are either duplicative or inactive? Again, I'm gonna raise my hand here. Vendors come in and say, it's great. Anyone can create a group with a touch of a button. There's no barriers. And more groups are better. And from a user perspective, it really helps to not allow that to happen, to have some governance in place, to limit the number of groups or channels that you really have to deal with, to have some checks and balances in place to make sure new groups need to be created, or that you really need to be a part of that group. And that really comes out in the data. People want some rules around this. Not very many have them. And then when we look at people who are really getting more effectiveness out of their collaborative environment, it's better for team building, it's better for innovation, it's easier to find the right colleagues to collaborate with, it's easier to share and reuse knowledge. The common denominator, or one of them that we see across those people who are getting better outcomes, is that they have rules for joining or being added to virtual groups. So I think that's really important. So some simple ideas for streamlining. What can we do to simplify? I know that a lot of organizations have let a thousand flowers bloom, but I'm going to put a stake in the ground and make a really strong case for standardization here. Consolidation means fewer options for people to navigate. It also avoids people going off and creating their own collaboration silos. You may have some teams that have some really unique needs and need unique tools, but they shouldn't have to make a business case for that. And that should be the exception rather than the rule. You should be trying to push people towards a limited standard toolkit. And then obviously integrate the apps as much as possible, provide single sign on, and when apps do have overlapping capabilities, you need to make some business rules, at least at the team level. And Alyssa and I have a great example of that in our research team. We use Microsoft Teams for a lot of our conversation around projects and file sharing. And then we use Asana, which is a project management app for tasks and assigning work to people in the context of those projects. Both those platforms have collaboration capabilities. You can chat and you can put documents in both of them. So we have some very clear business rules that documents go in teams and conversation goes in teams, whereas in Asana, you're only assigning tasks and assigning tasks back and commenting on those tasks. And it's not perfect, but it's definitely, prevents a lot of confusion. And then along those same lines, going through the survey comments, so many people are frustrated by the continued focus on email for internal communication. So if you have a collaboration platform, use it. Drive as much communication there as possible and leave email for those external exchanges. And then finally, you need to set some kind of rule for, avoiding those millions of overlapping or unnecessary groups and teams. Create a process for that and also a process to delete the old ones. Because this is one of those things that's just going to get more and more cluttered the longer we go forward. So next I want to talk about, something we've been dancing around all morning, which is the need for organizations as a whole and individual managers and teams to set better norms and guidelines for virtual collaboration. And the lack of norms and guidelines comes out loud and clear in this data. We ask people, well, how do norms get established in your organization? And they say, oh, they emerge ad hoc as groups work together. And then you ask, well, how are those norms communicated? Well, they're communicated informally when problems come up. It's all reactive. And then, well, how are the norms, enforced or reinforced? Well, individual collaborators are supposed to crowdsource and, police themselves in these platforms. So it all kind of feels a little bit like a recipe for disaster for me, Alyssa. And I know we've been talking about this as well.
Exactly, Lauren. This slide really concerned me because one of the trends that's been going on and is predicted to continue to go on is a movement of organizations towards more project-based work and also towards having a more distributed workforce, different types of workers. So you have your permanent workers, you have more contingent workers. And so when I see informal and ad hoc, um, that's just not going to be sufficient in the world that we're moving toward. You will not be able to sustain those norms that you put in place over the long haul with people coming and going into project teams and into your organization. So there's definitely a need to do something more.
And I definitely got some comments that people didn't think this was a problem, but I think what you're saying, people are relying on their corporate culture right now to varying degrees of success. I'm not saying that's working for everyone, but where it is working, I think you have to be aware that that may work less well down the road than it is now.
Exactly. Need to be thinking further down the road.
So the more I look at this issue of norms and guidelines, I feel like we are absolutely living in a wild, wild west scenario. And I just think that there's no rules and people are being left to do what they think is best with very few limits on that. And I think that concerns both Alyssa and me. And I don't think leaders have thought through all of the dangers of that. I was reading an article in the New York Times this Sunday titled, "How to Keep Internet Trolls Out of Remote Workplaces," all about employees treating enterprise collaboration platforms the same way they do the rest of the internet and getting into political brawls, bullying, discrimination, all these things that we don't want to have happen in the workplace, and all with a trail of digital breadcrumbs that creates legal liability for companies, among other things, including a terrible work experience for people. So I thought this was a good opportunity to remind everyone of three of the top 5 challenges that people see with virtual collaboration. These insufficient norms and policies, overlapping and disconnected platforms, and insufficient training. So I think it's clear that people want some rules of the road. They don't want this to feel as chaotic and uncivil as the rest of the internet. So I don't see any way around it. We need better rules and expectations. And again, we've talked about it a couple of times. This is where you get into trouble when IT owns the virtual collaboration strategy. You need those more people-oriented groups to help write the handbook and align it to corporate policies and organizational culture. And then you need targeted training, how leaders can set the stage, how managers can role model and reinforce those behaviors, and what you expect from every individual, what that social contract is in the digital workplace. And you can't just crowdsource reinforcement. That's great. And if people are inadvertently outside the norms, people can probably nudge them back, but you need to engage managers in helping with this. And if, God forbid, you have a serious issue, then you need a clear path to deal with that as well. It's all really important. So the final imperative that I want to talk about, and honestly, I think this might be the most important of them all, is the need to establish boundaries for collaborative time. And the research, we looked at this in a couple of different categories. First is set hours where collaboration will and will not occur. So if I get a message at 9 p.m., am I supposed to respond to that? Can it wait for the morning? If somebody invites me to a 5 a.m. meeting with a client in India, am I expected to take that? When can I push back? What are the expectations for collaborating outside my normal working hours? And then the next two on this list I see as in close relationship with one another. The first is expectations for availability. Are there times, almost like professorial office hours, that I set aside when I'm going to be hyper responsive, I'm going to be available to answer people's questions, to work collaboratively, and that's going to be my focus? And then on the flip side, am I allowed or encouraged to block off time when I won't be as responsive because I'm focusing on deep work, things that require sustained concentration? And then finally, we've thrown standard response times into this because I think that can help clarify some of the boundaries as well. If you know, for example, that you have 24 hours to respond to a certain type of request. And what we find is that relatively few organizations have any of these kinds of norms in place. And that's especially true for these allowances for deep work. Only 15% have that. But around a third of people say that these kinds of guidelines would make virtual collaboration in their workplace more effective. And one thing that jumped out at me when I took a step deeper into the data is that the younger people, millennials and Gen Z, are the ones who most want these boundaries. For example, if you look at allowances for deep work, half of millennials said that having that would make them more effective. And so this may be generational, but I think it also may speak to the roles people are in, how much pressure they feel to be responsive to leaders and supervisors, and how much autonomy they have over their own schedules. I think that older workers, people in higher level roles, may not understand the need for this as much because they have more power to set their agenda. And even without norms in place, they feel empowered to do some of these things. And not only do people want better boundaries, but we definitely see this lack of boundaries taking a clear toll on productivity and satisfaction. So about 1 in 4 people said that one of the biggest challenges for them in virtual collaboration is that being responsive and the ding, 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 ding of Teams or Slack or whatever it is taking time and mental energy away from their core work activities. And then we also looked at people who are satisfied or very satisfied with the state of collaboration in their workplace. And one of the only common denominators in that group was that they're more likely to have set hours when collaboration will occur. So these boundaries also, they seem to improve our ability to do change management. They make it easier to share and reuse knowledge in virtual settings. We see a lot of different correlations. So I think that that's all really important. So I think the first step is to set out some clear norms for the organization, and ask leaders and managers to communicate them and role model them and tell people why these boundaries are good. They're not just, a perk. They're something that can make us all more productive and effective in the virtual workplace. And then you do need to differentiate and disaggregate this by role. There are people who part of their job is to answer that 3 a.m. phone call, but a lot of people really don't. And encouraging a frank two-way conversation between managers and employees is really helpful here. And then I think one of the most important things is establishing a culture where people can unplug from these collaborative platforms to focus on strategic work, analytical work, creative work. Maybe you establish a no meetings Friday, or encourage people to block time on their calendars. And it's really important to be transparent. You don't want people to disappear and not know where they are, but that it's okay to say, hey, I'm in focus time and I'm not going to respond to your message. If you really need me, you can text me or call me, but I'm not going to sit and look at all of the alerts on the general chat of people's cat memes right now because I'm working on an important project. And then finally, I think we have to be really careful about evaluating employees on their responsiveness. Because Alyssa, you and I were talking about this as we were prepping for this call, and you were pointing out to me that we can set all of the norms in the world, but if people still think that they're being measured on this, then it won't matter.
Exactly. And because your survey here shows that people want these norms, they want these boundaries. And so I'm worried that companies are going to assume if we give them these, they'll automatically use them. And my concern is if you don't also take into account how your organization handles performance management and assessment, how you handle career development in a remote setting, and also provide training to your managers and your leaders about these things, that employees will be reluctant to do what they really want to do, because they're concerned, especially now, about job security. So you really need to address this holistically, to make sure that what you set in place actually gets executed.
It's really interesting. I was thinking about it as analogous to PTO and vacation policies, that you can offer people a certain number of vacation days a year, but unless managers role model taking vacation and actually encourage people to take vacation and really clearly communicate that they want people to take vacation, then they may not use that benefit.
Exactly, and you can't underscore the importance of managers in solving these issues, and getting people to use these collaboration tools that can make virtual collaboration better. And a lot of managers were just thrown into this, so it's really important that companies backtrack and provide some guidance for managers and support so they can nudge their employees in the right direction.
Yeah, I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that maybe somebody's been a manager for 20 years, but they haven't been a virtual manager for
Exactly.
even 1 year. And we need to make sure that we're providing that kind of support, and getting people getting people ready for this brave new world.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I wanted to end with another poll and find out where all of you are in terms of these imperatives and challenges that we've laid out. What you think is the most urgent challenge for your workplace, your organization to solve? Is it around virtual meetings and the culture and frequency of that? Is it around enabling cross-boundary collaboration? Is it around streamlining those options and figuring out what goes where? norms and guidelines, setting those in place, communicating them, enforcing them, or around this last topic around setting boundaries. And as you guys are answering that question, we're going to move to Q&A right after this. So start thinking about if there's any questions or comments that you have. You can raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you. I think we should have time to do that if anybody wants to talk to us. I know everyone has opinions on this topic, so I'm interested to see where everyone is and what everyone's response is to the data. Oh, really interesting. So the top two, cross-boundary collaboration, getting people out of those silos, and also establishing those norms and guidelines. But a pretty even mix across the group.
Lauren, I'll just add really quickly as people are hopefully submitting their questions, that as the pandemic has gone on and people have been working remote longer, I hear that from HR leaders that they're really concerned about employee burnout and employee well-being. And so I think any of these options on the poll would be a great place for an organization to start. I mean, it won't alleviate all of the things that are troubling employees right now, but you can take a step towards alleviating some things with any of those actions.
Well, and I'm so glad that you talked about employee listening, because the problems may be different for different employees, for different groups of employees, or for different organizations. So I feel like now is a good time for a survey. Now is a good time for a focus group. Find out what those pain points are and see if there are little things that you can do to help with that.
Exactly.
So I know that we had some resources we wanted to just quickly share. The first link here is to all of the research that I shared today, and we will have more writing and analysis coming out over the next month or two. I also have a collection of research and case studies and things that we did last year about sort of engaging people in virtual collaboration. There's some great stuff in there. Our chairman, Carla Odell, has a great new article on encouraging collaboration in the new reality, touching on a lot of the things that we talked about today. And we also have some great case studies of how knowledge management has stepped up in 2020 and in the world of COVID, and a lot of that touches on virtual collaboration. And Alyssa, I know you have some resources on here too.
I did, and they're really around remote work. And we went to remote work really quickly, and we made it work in a crisis situation. But I think there's an opportunity now to revisit how we can put in place, the infrastructure for long-term success with remote work. And so those resources could help with that.
Absolutely.
And Lauren, I do have one question that I think is for you. So I'm going to ask it. And the listener is wondering if the data that you presented today is US only. And if it's not, they want to know, are you going to be looking at differences between countries or regions?
So it is not. It's a pretty global data set. I would say it's about half US and North America, and the rest is pretty evenly split between EMEA and Asia Pacific. So we definitely will look at some regional differences. It's a little tricky sometimes with global companies, and people are kind of speaking on behalf of global companies, and I think that sometimes that can create some confusion in the data. But it's interesting when you get down to a lot of the different demographic differences, because I've already done analysis by gender. I did a blog post on some of the differences we see between men and women on the survey. We're looking a lot at the different generations, job role. I've looked at managers versus non-managers. That stuff's always interesting. Oh, managers think that managers are in charge of this. Employees who are not managers think no one is in charge of this, things like that. So when you get kind of down to some of those differences, it gets really interesting to understand people's different perspectives.
All right. Lots of questions.
Yeah, I know, it's always great to get so many. So here's one for you, Alyssa.
Okay.
In my experience, groupthink has increased significantly with virtual collaboration. How do managers and leaders prevent this?
Yeah, it's a concern. I hear from HR leaders that they're very concerned that some employees will be left behind, that they won't be heard or seen in the virtual environment, and that more vocal employees, employees who are more likely to collaborate even on virtual platforms are going to dominate the discussions. And I think there's a lot of validity to that concern. And I think managers and leaders need to be really deliberate about calling, and finding ways to include those people, calling them, on a, to participate in a meeting, give them advance notice, that you're going to do that, but finding opportunities for them in their own way to participate, because you need that diversity of thought, and you of course want all employees to be, heard and engaged.
Yeah, and I was just telling Alyssa this yesterday. We did ask some questions about diversity of opinion on the survey, and the differences are really different by industry and some of those demographic groups. So I think getting down and understanding what people's experiences are is really important there. So I have a question here around explaining the relationship or difference between KM and virtual collaboration. I think that's really important, so I want to address it. I think that virtual collaboration and KM are probably a Venn diagram where there's some overlap, but also some things that don't overlap. And I think that you can have a knowledge management strategy and a virtual collaboration strategy that have some points of intersection. But when you talk about knowledge management, I think you really want to be looking at how information gets to people so that they can do their jobs. And there's going to be offline and online aspects to that. There's going to be explicit and tacit knowledge aspects to that. And to me, virtual collaboration is a set of tools that can be used, in part to support knowledge management goals. But then there's also aspects of virtual collaboration that probably have less to do with knowledge flow and information flow inside your organization, but are still important. Things that kind of speak to team building and camaraderie. I would not put virtual meetings in most cases into the knowledge management bucket, but I would put it into the virtual collaboration bucket. So I think that a lot of KM teams have gotten really involved in virtual collaboration because that was the urgent need of the organization, but I don't want people to lose sight of the other aspects of KM, like expert knowledge transfer, for example, that probably isn't going to happen on a Microsoft Teams chat, and let those things converge too much, because you lose a lot as well.
Lauren, I'm looking at just one comment from someone who said that, their KM team was virtual before COVID, but around the same time as COVID, they experienced a merger, and then all of a sudden they had two of everything, in terms of places to collaborate. And so they were good at virtual collaboration, and then they had this merger come in. And I think it just points to that this is an ongoing need, that you need to always be focused on this, because things do change. Employees change. The shape of your company changes.
It's really interesting because I think we've watched our members suffer through mergers and acquisitions for many years, and there's a lot of analogies to COVID because you think you're going into something, it's going to move a lot faster than it actually does. And the reality of especially large scale mergers is it takes years and years to actually integrate systems, much less all of these other things. So I think there's some really important things that knowledge management and especially something like an expertise location system, integrating your communities of practice, that all of that can do. But IT can only move so fast. So sometimes you have to kind of just come up with some easy ways for people to collaborate, even if they're on different systems. And, you just have to have a virtual meeting and get, that's where the human aspect comes in, because sometimes that can move faster than the technology piece.
Makes sense.
So I know we have a lot more questions and comments in here, and I'm going to go through those and see if we can do anything fun and interesting with them. But I know that we are at time, and I want to make sure that we don't overstay our welcome here. So I want to just thank everyone for attending. Thank you, Alyssa, for sort of helping me think through some of this data and talk through it. And thank you everyone for attending. I know this is a super personal topic for a lot of people, so I'm looking forward to going through all of your questions and comments, and we will get back to those, and maybe we can do some sort of Q&A piece or something like that to address some of that. All right, great. Well, thank you everyone, and I hope to see you for next month's webinar.